folks, it's me, your friendly neighborhood thought criminal slash Russian operative slash fake news reporter slash poopy head. I'm here to talk to you about fake news. I'm going to try to keep this brief and to the big ideas. You can hear about all the other stuff elsewhere, but I want to talk about a couple of the big ideas that I think are important when talking about fake news. First of all, fake news is a thing that people are throwing a lot of stink about because this idea that Google is going to censor, quote, fake news and Facebook is going to censor, quote, fake news has a lot of people on edge, and I think it's very rightfully so. There is a blacklist that's been going around that includes not just legitimate fake news, like the clickbait articles that, so and such celebrity has died, and you click through and it just farms out ad revenue. But they've been included with that in that same category, things like InfoWars, a whole host of things that are alternative media, Breitbart, those sorts of things. And what's important to know about that is that in this case, fake news right now could contain basically anyone who doesn't share the mainstream media's narrative. And narrative is the key. And the ability to discern, quote, what is truth and what is false in this circumstance is a lot hairier than I think people realize. Because there's obvious fake news like, Jim Carrey has died and he hasn't died, and that's just fake. But what is really, the thing that matters here is the interpretation of a story. Narrative, if you've ever heard them talk about, we don't believe their narrative. We reject that narrative. We're going to have a different narrative. Narrative is a really important concept when we're talking about news. Because when you read news, you're not just reading news, you're reading a news story. We are creatures that communicate through stories. Not only do we communicate through stories, but we write our memories with stories. Now, someone has asked me about the Mandela effect, and I will make a video about that shortly. But there's a concept that applies to this that also applies to the Mandela effect, and that is that we don't remember things. We're not camcorders, and we're not recording our memories like a camcorder to play back later. Our memories are written the same way that a writer writes a story. And as a writer, I like to think about this sort of thing, that the context is what has to be added to any particular factoid in order to make it relevant for us to remember it. I couldn't tell you how tall Mount Whitney is, but I could tell you it's the tallest mountain in the lower 48 states of the United States. And Mount McKinley is the tallest mountain. When I'm saying Mount McKinley is the tallest mountain in the United States, in Alaska, what am I doing? I'm putting it in a context of all the other mountains. It's the tallest. Mount Whitney's the tallest in the lower 48 United States. So I'm putting it into a context, I'm putting it into an area, I'm comparing it to other objects, and that's how I remember that factoid, that it's the tallest in the lower 48 states. It's a context dependent idea. Because we can't just remember factoids independent of context. Our brain will just release them as it doesn't use that information. So putting things in context is really important. So when you're presenting a news story to someone, there's facts that are involved with it, but the context in which you present those facts can have a big impact on what people think. And the attempt, this is why media is so dangerous and so powerful, and why we need alternative media, regardless of whoever benefits from whatever narrative, is that the way you control how those facts are presented is going to have an impact on what narrative people write in their minds, and then will also have a future impact in future things that are written into their mind. And I'm going to give you a little example. So if you were to pick up a newspaper, and we've had examples of it this year, although I'm just kind of riffing off the top of my head. I'm sure you can point to some ones that are pretty close. You may see a headline that is another unarmed black man has been killed, or you may see someone come on the news and say another unarmed black man has been killed by a police officer in such and such town in such and such state. Now, just saying that by itself, it's like an unarmed black man has been killed by a police officer. That is factual, right? And we're just going to say that that's a factual story. But think about the context that they put it in. Another unarmed black man, which means that this is part of some larger pattern, right? So that's going to cue people in. That's going to say, hey, remember when we talked about this 3 months ago? yeah, remember that happened already, and the person's going to cue back to when they first heard about an unarmed black man was killed by a police officer, and they're probably going to skim over anything that followed that, because that first imprinting is what is most powerful, and then we have a reinforcement of that context. But if we read an alternative media presentation of it, which of course ends up taking more time, Rush Limbaugh used to call the mainstream media the drive-by media, because they just give you these tidbits of what's going on, and they don't really give you enough information to know. They give you enough to think like create like some basic context and have a basic idea. But it takes much longer to really dive into what's going on. So when you look at a lot of alternative media sources, including InfoWars, but I think of also like Stefan Molyneux's channel on YouTube, that he will take a whole hour to explain this particular story that happened with the cop killing an unarmed black man. And so what you would see, like the counter narrative, so the first narrative is another cop has killed an unarmed black man. And what you're missing from that is all the things that led up to that particular thing happening. You've replaced like the real context with just some other context, that like there's a war on blacks from police officers. And so if you were to imagine a different narrative, a counter narrative, it would say you might tell a longer story in order to provide enough context for someone to understand what happened and why. Is that, police, on Thursday afternoon, police were searching for a robbery suspect in a Toyota Camry. Such and such police officer happened to notice a similar looking suspect driving the same color car as the suspect they were pursuing. He turned on his siren and he pulled the car over, and the car pulled over, and a man ran out of the car and ran away from the police officer. The police officer gave pursuit. The man was knocked down, and the police officer ordered the man to get on the ground. The man got up and did not get on the ground, but backed away from the police officer, holding his hand inside of his breast pocket. At which time the police officer drew his weapon, ordered once again the suspect to get on the ground, and the suspect reached further in and looked like he was pulling out a gun, and then the police officer shot him, and it turned out he didn't have a gun. Right? And so all that context is like, okay, all these other events happened that you just didn't hear mentioned. That they were looking for a suspect. He matched the description of that suspect. He fled from police. He refused to follow the orders of the police. He made a threatening gesture, and then the police officer finally discharged his firearm after all of that stuff. And then you find out later he did actually rob the store, maybe, right? And that comes out days later after everybody's already written the narrative in their mind, and that extra factoid just doesn't have a way to go into that. You already have this context that a police officer murdered an unarmed black man, like shot him in the back of the head, when that's not what really happened. And in most of these cases this year, where the media's trumped up these stories, you find out in a couple days later, and especially through alternative media that's looking through the local stuff, that's actually looking at all the reports and not just giving you this very thin drive-by version of it. That in those circumstances, it was pretty much never a case of like just unprovoked murder. It was like a much more complex situation than people were giving it credit for, where a reasonable person put in that situation might have acted the same as that police officer and killed that civilian. Or it may come out later that, there's a video of it happening, and it's like, oh, this is going to damn that police officer, and it exonerates him because you put yourself in that police officer's place, and you're looking at like, is he going to pull a weapon and kill me? Am I going to be in a fight for my life? And you always want to be, this is like, I've tried to remember who said this. I think it was my father. It's like, and if you see the firefight coming, like you always want to be the first one to fire. You always want to be the first one to throw a punch. You always want to be the person who starts the fight, because that's the quickest way to end the fight. And so that's the way that you're going to do it, is that you're going to prevent yourself from being harmed by firing first. That's a really common thing. So anyway, we have these two narratives. One was really short and put into context, alluding to different things happening that have nothing to do with this story. And the second one was lots of events happening that created a more thorough narrative. And so when you label you give the label of fake news to these alternative media, YouTube channels and websites that are giving this other narrative, That's what I see the problem is that you're trying to control who's trying to tell the right narrative and who's trying to create the right context for the piece. That's really, I think, what's at stake. Now, the other thing about fake news is that in this case, let's say that there's like a compelling case that this alternative media outlet really didn't, it's like the police officer really didn't see him put his hand inside the coat. Like we see the video and the guy was just standing there and the police officer shot him, right? Well, we have evidence that runs contrary to that. People can dig this up. The real danger, of course, is pre-deciding for any viewer what is and is not worthy of consideration when they are building the narrative in their mind. Nobody, here's my piece of wisdom for the video. Nobody restricts your access to information for your benefit. And they do it for someone else's benefit. It's not for your benefit. Now, those people who are worried that there's going to be like this plague of idiots that just believe anything, regardless of how true or false it is, well, that already exists, and it's called people watching the mainstream media and just believing that narrative as it is. And I run into them all the time. There's people that are like, Trump hates all immigrants. I'm like, Trump's married to an immigrant. I don't know, like, where you get this stuff, right? And I mean, like it's insane some of the things that people construct out of that mainstream media narrative. And so, in a lot of cases, it's like a sin of omission. Or we take the facts and we put them so far out of the context of the original statement that it just doesn't like end up registering with them. And there's a whole bunch of rhetoric techniques where you can tell the truth but tell a lie at the same time. The mainstream media also promotes like stories that are told by an anonymous person about the horrors of the Republican Party or something like that. And that's BS and that's fake. And my whole point is, if you have the opportunity, the one group has the opportunity to try to demonetize and censor the other group because they have a different bias and a different spin on the news than their bias and spin on the news. It's not that like, this alternative media source has no bias. It's just they have a different bias. And if you can eliminate that different bias, then you get to control that narrative to a much greater extent. And that's what they want. And then why do they want it? Well, they lost an election because of that alternative media that was presenting that other narrative all the time. I think it's purely political. That is my opinion on it. And I will also say that 2 years ago, I actually started a series that I didn't really continue, and maybe I'll pick it back up, called The Everyday Skeptic. And the whole idea of that series, although it was massively unpopular at the time, just no one liked it, I guess, and no one watched it. The idea was to create a set of tools that anyone can use to quickly determine whether something is true or false, or whether they should believe it or not, or ask for more evidence or whatever else. So I had like a series, I did a series of articles and a series of videos, and I had in my mind, I'm like, I know these people that are they believe crazy things that like, and I'm saying they're crazy, but they're not crazy because you believe the things that are told that fit into the context that makes sense to you. They're not crazy, so I take that back. It's just they're believing things that aren't true because they're very compelling to believe them, and it fits a narrative that they like. And it's like vitamin C and cannabis oil cure cancer. This whole bit of like medical marijuana has created so many weird false narratives in people's minds. It's kind of staggering. We've gone from like, hey, maybe we should legalize cannabis because you could use it to prevent nausea if you were, undergoing chemotherapy, or you could use it possibly as a pain reliever or something like that. And at least we should have let people be able to put this drug in their bodies for medicinal purposes, right? And a lot of libertarians supported that because it was the gateway to full legalization of the drug, which is, the less people you're jailing for substances they put in their body, the better from the libertarian perspective. And frankly, I share that. I think it's a waste to lock someone up because they wanted to smoke a plant. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of their time. It's a waste of our time. Anyway, let me stop injecting that particular opinion, but just go back to that. So that fits that narrative that like, they don't want people to have access to pot because it cures cancer, and cancer is a big moneymaker. It's like, just because this is a fun narrative to think about, like these big bad drug companies suppressing a like very cheap medicine, does not mean it's true. It's like there's no evidence that cannabis oil does anything other than like get you high. So what's the point here? But anyway, so they believe these things because they're really compelling to believe, or like the water powered car things that you see pop up every once in a while. So I created this series called The Everyday Skeptic, and maybe I'll link it down below, maybe not. And my whole idea was we need to give people the tools that are necessary to quickly determine truth from reality. And I still believe that, even though it wasn't successful. The people who need to really decide is the end user. If you give anybody the power, whether it's a corporation, I mentioned corporate censorship is the real danger right now. If you give it to a very, very powerful corporation in the internet world, we have two of them, Facebook and Google, which control like a majority of the traffic. Majority of the traffic on the American internet, at least, goes through those two companies. If they're able to control how that traffic works, that's a big problem for free speech. The concept of free speech, not the constitutional protection of free speech, but the concept that we should all be able to freely express ourselves and reach those people that we want to. The internet's allowed us to do that, and any kind of restriction on that I consider a bad thing. But anyway, if we allow them to decide for us or for other people that we consider stupider than ourselves, then what you're really doing is you're giving them the key, you're giving them that ring of power. You're giving them the ring of power and saying, I trust you to not be the Dark Lord Sauron. And inevitably, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And they're going to end up using that power, even if you are totally in agreement with the whole fake news thing. They're going to use it to suppress your dissenting opinion one day. Because remember, free speech is a big package. It includes everybody. And you have to have the whole package or none of it works. Okay, that's my definite thoughts on that. And there's also a little bit of a lesson to be learned here with the internet as well, that which makes us, that which is a convenience to us, can also have the possibility to enslave us. That is a deep-reaching statement, and I can leave it to you to think of all the different ways that that's true in our modern society. But the convenience there of Google is that the internet is vast and difficult to navigate. So we have a search engine that will make it really easy for us to find the information we're looking for on the internet. And when that becomes so convenient that we rely on it constantly, well, that can become part of the key to our enslavement, because we have no other way. We forget the other ways that we used to access this stuff. And that's the danger. That's the danger there. So that which gives us convenience also has the possibility to enslave us. And the second one is nobody who restricts your access to information is doing it for your benefit. So that's the short version. There's so much more to dig into that. Other people are doing a much deeper job of talking about who's saying what about fake news. So go check those other channels out. Dave Cullen, Stefan Molyneux, Sargon of Akkad. They're all going to dig a little deeper into this, but I wanted to give you the big concept. It's important to know that we are writing stories in our mind all the time, every day, every time we think about something, every time we encounter someone. We're writing that story in our mind, and when we rewrite that memory, it's really the memory we've written, not the things as they are, because we have to create context for things to make sense to us as human beings. So have a great night. I will see you next time, and I hope you're having a fabulous week. Don't forget to check back my other video. It's got giveaways. I wanted to give away all those books. Let's get them given away. Let's get some support to my author friends. You guys have a great day.